Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today, I'm joined by best-selling author and award-winning journalist and film historian Phil Hall. Phil's newest book, Jesus Christ Movie Star, tells the history of JC on the big screen, from silent film straight through to the digital age. It was published earlier this month by BearManor Media and is already topping the Amazon charts. Phil has 9 other books to his credit, including the critically acclaimed titles The History of Independent Cinema and In Search of Lost Films, as well as the ebook-only Moby Dick the radio play. Additionally, he is the host of the SoundCloud podcast The Online Movie Show and co-host of the WAPJ FM talk show NUTMEG Chatter, and has also appeared in horror movies, often as the bad guy. A longtime journalist, his writing for West Fair Communications has earned multiple awards from the Connecticut Press Club and the Connecticut Society of Professional Journalists. Phil's bylines also include contributions to the New York Times, the New York Daily News, the Hartford Courant, and Wired, among others. Jesus Christ Movie Star is a project that melds Phil's interests with his background as a reporter, resulting in a work that's both highly informative and entertaining. Not surprisingly, the praise has been enthusiastic. Georgette Govea, editor-in-chief of WAG magazine, said, "Whether you're a believer, and Jesus is God or the cinema for that matter, you'll be engaged by the way Hall blends his passion for film and his Christian faith with his gifts for smooth storytelling and quirky detail." Now, join Phil Hall as he reveals fascinating insights about the greatest story ever told on film. Hey everybody, welcome back to Central Booking. Today I am speaking with Phil Hall, who is a best-selling author, award-winning journalist, also a podcaster, and a radio host. So you kind of do it all. Welcome to the show, Phil.
Well, thank you. There's so much of me to be here, isn't there?
There is. So many hats. You know, I told you couldn't wear your hats because they wouldn't all fit in this little Zoom screen. Too many. So anyway, you have a brand new book out. It's Jesus Christ Movie Star, hot off the presses. And so I figured I would begin with the very, very obvious, or maybe not. People who might not know you may not know that, religion and film are sort of two of your passions, two of your interests. So I was wondering if you can tell us what inspired you to explore the unity of these two in this new book.
Well, I had originally planned to do a book about Pontius Pilate's wife, who was only mentioned in one sentence of the Gospel of Mark. And I was doing research into it, and while I was researching, it sort of dawned on me that even if I were to complete the book, would I be able to get it published? Because I'm primarily known as a film writer, not as a religious scholar. So I could create this wonderful book, but would any publication want to run with it? So while I was doing the research into Pilate's wife, who was popularly known as Claudia, although she's not identified by that name in the Gospel, I noticed that a lot of films had this character turning up over and over, even though she's absent from 3 of the Gospels. And as I've mentioned, she's only in one sentence where she sends a message to Pilate saying not to have anything to do with Jesus because she had a dream that upset her greatly, which involved Jesus. And I figured, well, there's so many different films about Jesus, and they're really, no 2 films are alike. Every film seems to be taking its own different perspective on the life and ministry of Jesus. Why not do a book on the subject? And I pitched it to my publisher, BearManor Media, and that's where Jesus Christ Movie Star came from. For myself, I actually have a background in religious studies. That was my minor when I went to Pace University. I had considered a career in the ministry at one point, but opted not to go that way. And I see the book as basically being something of a common ground between my own faith and the path that I did choose, which was being a writer, primarily being a film writer. So that's a rather lengthy answer to your short question.
No, I like it. That's the whole point. I give little tidbits and then you just expand them. It's what you do. But that's great. And I did want to ask you, about the book's introduction, because it opens, with kind of a really funny, I guess, if You have a sense of humor. Anecdote from Rich Sear, who's your co-host on Nutmeg Junction. And I was wondering if you would share that with us, because it also, it sort of gives the background on how you narrowed down the scope of this book, because it could be such an overwhelming topic. And, so you sort of had to pick and choose what you were going to cover and also what you were not going to cover. So if you wouldn't mind sharing that.
All right, well, actually, the show is Nutmeg Chatter. There is a
Sorry.
show called Nutmeg Junction, which Rich and I are involved with, but that's not the show we co-host. Well, Rich and I are co-hosts of a weekly radio program here in Connecticut called Nutmeg Chatter, and I had told Rich that I was going to be writing this book, and one day he came into the studio and said, "Hey, Phil, have you ever heard of the movie Jesus Christ Serial Rapist?" And I said, "No, I haven't." And he said, "Oh, it's got the greatest tagline. First he nails you, then he nails you." And I'm like, okay.
For the book.
But yeah, but it's like, I appreciated the input, but I also realized too that there are just so many films with Jesus as a character that there had to be some sort of parameters, because otherwise I'd wind up with a 15 volume set. So one of the parameters would be that the films would have to be in theatrical release, not movies that were made for television, not films that were direct to video, such as Jesus Christ Serial Rapist, which is the last I'll be speaking of it in this interview. Not films that were made for the educational market or directly for churches. So in a way that was good, because it gave me some shape to work with. In a way it wasn't so good, because a lot of very worthwhile productions were not included, including most notably Franco Zeffirelli's Jesus of Nazareth, which was a TV miniseries from the 1970s. Also the Rossellini film, The Messiah, which was made for Italian television. So those were not included. I also wanted to focus on the adult Jesus. There are several films specifically about the Nativity, wonderful films, but the focus isn't really on Jesus. It's more on Mary and Joseph, which is worthwhile, but that's another story, at least from my perspective. So those films were not included as well. And also I did not include films where the main characters imagined themselves to be Jesus, either through delusional thinking or through religious mania. And again, there are a lot of very good movies like that. Jesus of Montreal, Oscar-nominated Canadian film, and Drea's film Ordette come to mind. So unfortunately, they're not in the book, but I had more than enough to work with. And in doing the research, I was able to cover films about the adult Jesus starting in 1897 going to 2020. So it's a lot to work with.
Sure, and I was going to say, if you included everything, it would be a much thicker book.
Yes.
There's so much. But let me ask you too, so, a lot of people may not realize that the Christ story, has been depicted in film to its various earliest inception, like going back to the 1890s, as you just mentioned. So consequently, their histories and the evolutions are kind of linked. So not only are you getting the history of Jesus Christ in film, but you're sort of getting the history of film itself. So can you talk a little bit about how that works as a framework for this book?
Certainly will. And if you hear a dog barking, and that's the neighbor's dog outside. So there he goes. So,
He's just into it.
Okay, so he hasn't read the book yet, so he's just.
But he wants to.
What happened with the beginnings of film, and this is what really surprised me, is that many of the first movies made from 1897, 1898 into 1900 were about Jesus. And I was wondering, well, how come these weren't really emphasized in so many of the history books about the development of the silent cinema? Well, that's because most of these films don't exist anymore. You can't really write about films that are lost, except to mention the fact that they are lost. Some of these films do have an interesting backstory. The first American film on the topic was made in 1898, called The Passion Play of Oberammergau. And this was presented as a filmed record of the German Passion Play, which is staged every 10 years in the village of Oberammergau, except for the fact that it wasn't. It was a fraud. The film was shot on the rooftop of a New York City skyscraper. They didn't have the proper lights back in 1898 to illuminate a movie, so they used natural sunlight, and they had painted backdrops. They created this film. They also created a poster to sell the movie, which is the first example of a movie poster for marketing purposes, and it opened in New York City. And even back then in 1898, we'd think, oh, they weren't very sophisticated. They weren't that dumb. And audiences and critics saw this and they realized this is not the Oberammergau Passion Play. This is a fraud. But they enjoyed it because it was a brand new medium. And uh, people were sitting looking up at a big screen with this pantomime of the life of Jesus. And it was done from the surviving material we have in a rather elaborate way, considering when it was made and the limitations that were in the budget and in the production. Uh, Unfortunately, we don't appreciate the film today except for its history because of Thomas Edison. Um, Edison had tried to create a monopoly on the nascent film industry, and he had a patent on the film projector. The people who made and distributed the Passion Play of Oberammergau had their own projector, but Edison took them to court claiming copyright infringement. And incredibly, the court sided with him, even though Edison really didn't have a very good case. So Edison took control of this film. He split up the movie into smaller bits that he could show in his kinetoscope, which was sort of a peep show device, a cabinet where people would look in through a window and see a film loop. Most of the loops have vanished. There's just a small fragment, which is at the George Eastman House in Rochester. But for better or worse, that's how American movies first approached Jesus.
Sure. And one of the things I found really interesting about the book is, as you mentioned, the first films were obviously silent, and then sound came in years later. And, whether a silent picture or one with sound, each one sort of presents unique challenges in how best to depict Jesus Christ on the screen. So I was wondering, if you could talk about those considerations for a silent film, and then also when there was the advent of the technology to do sound, what then complicated it for filmmakers in the depiction of Jesus.
Well, with the silent films, of course, up until about 1912, these films were made in a studio. And by today's standards, they look rather set bound, painted backdrops and whatnot. 1912 movie called From the Manger to the Cross was shot on location in what was then Palestine under the Ottoman rule. So that was the first example of actually having a biblical film shot in a biblical setting and not looked like it was painted backdrops in a studio. A lot of the silent films, strangely enough, the first movie, which I just mentioned, The Passion Play of Oberammergau, was a feature-length film. But then filmmakers decided to go from the longer films to short films. So we have films that are anywhere from 1, 2, or 3 reels, roughly about 10 to 30 minutes, and you can't really telescope the life of Jesus into something that brief. So obviously a lot would have to be taken out, or scenes would have to be conflated. Going into later into the 20s, there was the first version of Ben-Hur, which was produced by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. And the weird thing about that is that even though the subtitle is A Tale of the Christ, Jesus doesn't show up on screen except for an extended hand and a bit of his garment, and which is kind of odd, because if the movie is being marketed as The Tale of the Christ and there's no Christ to be seen. But this also created a situation which would go into the sound era, where a lot of American films decided that it would be better just to have Jesus' hand or maybe the back of his head, but not actually have a walking, talking Jesus. And this was also a problem when sound came in, because when you had the silent movies, nobody obviously could hear what the actors were saying, because there was no soundtrack. So the audience would imagine what Jesus would sound like. But once you had the microphone as well as the camera, you had a problem with actors doing their lines. And would it be considered offensive or comical if Jesus is speaking with a flat Midwestern accent, or a heavy New York accent, or a thick Georgia, Louisiana accent, or if he would have a British or French accent? So at first, the film industry decided they weren't going to do any sound films about the life of Jesus. I'll take the old silent movies and re-release them with synchronized music and sound effects, and that worked for a couple of years, but they couldn't keep showing these films over and over, and eventually they sort of tiptoed into having a walking, talking Jesus. The British had a very odd censorship issue. They did not want to have Jesus depicted on screen or have his voice. And the first film of the sound era that had Jesus as a character was a movie called The Wandering Jew, but you don't hear or see Jesus. There's actually an intertitle that flashes on the screen, which is supposed to be Jesus' dialogue while all of the actors are looking off screen from where Jesus is supposed to be. It's a very bizarre way to make a movie. Mercifully, they didn't do that again after that film came out. It wasn't until a French film called Golgotha in 1936 that we actually had an actor, Robert Le Villon, who was actually on the cover of the book, and he is the first Jesus that we see on screen and whose voice we hear.
Sure. I have to say, your knowledge is incredible. I'm very impressed. And I wanted to ask you, about your research process, because it is sort of like going down the rabbit hole. So how do you research a project like this? And then part two of the question is, how do you take this knowledge and apply it in a way that your book is sort of conversational? Because having read it, it's something that will appeal to scholars, but I think it's equally beneficial for a layperson. So you're really distilling this information in a way that's entertaining and informative. So can you talk about that, research and then translating it in that way?
That's very flattering. Thank you. The research required going through a lot of books, a lot of journals, a lot of websites, watching a lot of movies, tracking films down. Even after I had declared the book ready to go and had it in with the copy editors to make sure it was all proofread, I was still adding to the book. I was still finding films I didn't know existed because I wanted it to be as complete as possible. Because the research was so intensive, I was actually over deadline. I'm a year over deadline, and it's grateful that my publisher, BearManor Media, gave me the extra time to complete the book. In terms of writing in a conversational manner, I'm not the first person to write a book on the subject, but a lot of the books on the subject are academic texts. And anyone who reads academic books will know they are very well researched and they are very serious and perhaps a little too serious and a bit dry. As a writer, I try to reach a broadest audience as possible, not aiming to the lowest common denominator, but doing it in a manner where the style is light, it's conversational, but it is also informative. Outside of film work, I do a great deal of financial journalism for several publications and websites, including the Benzinga financial website. So I know how to tell a news story. And in this case, I'm telling the story, but rather than giving you a news item, I'm telling a story about the history of Jesus on film.
Sure. And this may be a little out there, maybe not, but speaking of capturing that conversational tone, as I mentioned at the outset, you're not only a journalist, but you're active as a podcaster, as a radio host. So a lot of, the work that you do involves speaking and oration. So I'm wondering if that comes into play when you're writing, editing, and revising a book. Can you talk to that, if that speaks to you?
It's interesting, yes. Well, when I'm editing, going over my work, I do recite it aloud just to make sure it sounds good to me. Of course, conversational English is not necessarily the same as written English. A lot of people speak in run-on sentences, which is fine when we're talking back and forth. Not so fine when you're trying to read a serious work. But it is, yes. It's I guess because I'm working both as a writer and a broadcaster slash podcaster, language is very important to me. So I do take the time to go over my work, read it aloud to myself to make sure that it sounds good as well as reads good. It's a time-consuming process, and I was fortunate. I actually had two copy editors that I worked with on this project because I wanted to ensure that I got it 100% right.
Sure. And I think you nailed it in my humble opinion. But I do think it's interesting because people that you talk to who actually read their work aloud often have a very different, impression of it versus what they see on the page. So it's just interesting to get that perspective. So last question specific to this book, and then if you don't mind, a few more general questions. But I did want to ask you, you have gone down the rabbit hole. You have watched so many of these films, and I'm wondering, for people who are looking to dig in, do you have ones that are, and they don't even have to be favorites, but ones that really stand out in your mind, good, bad, or otherwise, is very memorable given the breadth of what you had to, research to write this particular book?
Oh, there's so much to choose from, and it would be a reflection of my tastes, obviously. I don't think there's the greatest or worst of any film. It's just a personal matter. My favorite, I think there would be two favorites. One would be more of a traditional biblical epic, and that would be The Greatest Story Ever Told, which a lot of people don't really like, but I am in the minority. I do like the 1965 George Stevens epic with Max von Sydow as Jesus. The movie does have its quirks, including the all-star cast with cameos that sometimes seem to be inappropriate, and location shooting in the American Southwest that doesn't quite look like the Holy Land. But it's a beautifully filmed movie, beautifully scored. I think Max von Sydow is the most impressive Jesus. To me, he looks like an Eastern Orthodox icon come to life. There's a sense of otherworldliness to him that is absent from a lot of other actors who've played the role. For a more offbeat film, Johnny Cash did a movie in 1973 called The Gospel Road, which was shot on location in Israel. It features a country gospel soundtrack, and it's a wonderfully idiosyncratic film essay. There are actors who are recreating scenes from the Bible, but there's a lot of it is Johnny Cash going through the Holy Land, holding his Bible, speaking in that wonderful Johnny Cash voice, very solemn, very sincere. It's a strange film. It really shouldn't have worked, but it does work, and it's a reflection of an individual's proclamation of faith. And I think really that's, if any message would come from the book, is that there is no one way to look at this story. There are countless ways and countless interpretations, and to be respectful of everybody's take on the story.
Sure. And, I think that's a great point, because it's kind of a great inventory of the movies that are out there. And regardless of how you come at this topic, whether you're looking, for somber or for maybe a little bit more humorous, I mean, there is a movie for everything, as I have now learned. So I did want to ask you a bit about your background as well. We talked about the fact that you are a journalist, so you're publishing, in papers and online and books as well. And obviously publishing is a very volatile industry, but you've had a very successful career. So I'm wondering, what is your approach to that volatility? How do you embrace, sort of change and adaptability?
Prayer helps. It works too. I can assure you of that. I've been in the media business for over 35 years, even though I look like
nobody would believe this.
my teens. But it's always been a volatile industry. I had gone out of publishing in the early 90s because so many publications were closing and it wasn't a solid industry. I went into public relations and did that for 12 years, and then went back into the journalism field because public relations was undergoing a lot of problems by the mid-2000s. So it's one of those industries that's always suffering, always coughing, always creaking, but it never quite dies. And it somehow or other reinvents itself, for better or worse. There are a lot of online sites today, as opposed to magazines and newspapers. Quality, of course, is a big concern. I like to associate myself with publications and websites that do maintain the respect of the readers and the industries that they serve. Being in the media business it's been a wonderful learning experience, because I've gotten to meet so many fascinating people and had crash course education in everything from technology to retailing to health and science. Even something like this, the format that we're doing now, we're recording this on Zoom. I've had to become an expert in terms of doing this because a lot of my interviews are on the Zoom platform, both for written articles, which I use this for transcription, and also I've done videos for Westfair Communications, which have been up on their YouTube page as well. So it's been a great run, and I'm still running, and hope to keep doing that for as many years as I can.
Excellent. And to follow up on something that you said, journalism has changed so much in the way, we get our news and consume our news. So let me ask you that as well, thinking about time and technology and technique, what do you think still are the tenets of good journalism, and how do you stick to that in an age where everything now is very quick? The pace of it can be so frenetic. So what do you think is still the base, the grounding of good journalism?
I think it'd be the ability to tell a story succinctly, intelligently, with a distinctive voice. I think the successful journalists are those who, when you pick up their articles, you don't even have to look at the byline. You know immediately in the first sentence or two who wrote that. I've actually had friends tell me that they've picked up magazines in the letters to the editor section, and they could tell if the submission was from me just from the first couple of sentences. To me, I think that's really the best way to know to go about doing it, because there are a lot of writers out there who I don't really think they enjoy what they're doing. And I think also a key to successful journalism is enjoying what you do. Many writers are just doing it because it's a paycheck, and you get the feeling when you read their work that this is just something that was slapped together because it had to be slapped together. Whereas the writers who really have a great following and career longevity, you can tell the passion in their writing, the way that they use vocabulary, the way that they frame stories, the way the quotes are used. I think that's what separates okay journalism from excellent journalism.
Sure. So voice and passion, and that may dovetail with my next question. We'll see. But I always like to ask, for people who are tuning in and who are looking for, words of wisdom or some encouragement, what, in terms of a creative or writing life, is the best advice that you ever got, and the best advice that you never got and had to learn for yourself?
I don't believe I got any advice on writing life at all. I've been doing it since I was in college, on my college newspaper, or actually my high school newspaper for that matter. That doesn't really count because that was a real hit and miss type of situation. But I've been doing it so long, I never bothered to ask for advice. I just dived right in and kept doing it. And to be honest, I never really gave advice unless I'm doing an interview like this, because it's one of those things you have to learn for yourself. What works for me may not work for the next person, and vice versa. I have my approach to doing things. Other people don't. I had worked with somebody who was in his 20s, and he couldn't do phone interviews. He came from a generation where everything is texting and instant messaging. That when you actually had to pick up the phone to speak to somebody, he was like Ralph Cramden, like hamana, hamana, hamana. But I came from a generation just as computers were coming into the home and the workplace, and right before the internet got started too. So I was used to working by phone, and I have no problems picking up a phone and doing an interview on the fly that way, where a lot of younger writers are not able to do that.
Sure. That's very interesting. And it's funny, I've done 60 some odd of these episodes, and I talked to somebody last week and asked that same question, what would your best advice be, basically? And her best advice was to be wary of advice. And nobody had ever said that before, but it's so true, because it is, very subjective. So thank you for that perspective. And final question, of course, I have to ask you, you are always working. I'm assuming, your stove, there are so many pots, like so many pots on the stove, so many hats on your head. So what might people expect next from you? And this can be in journalism, if you have another book project that you're working on, whatever you want to tease, we want to know.
I don't know. I have no book projects lined up after this. Rich Sear and I co-host NUTMEG Chatter on Connecticut radio. We alternate hosting duties each week. If you're not in Connecticut, you can find us at nutmegchatter.com. I'm writing for the Cinema Crazed website every Friday with the Bootleg Files column, which I've been doing for about 15 or 16 years. I think I'm on the 780th installment of that weekly column, which focuses on classic and quirky movies and TV productions, which can only be found through bootlegged versions because they were never formally released on commercial DVD. As I mentioned a bit earlier, outside of film, I am writing for Benzinga, which is a financial news site. I do some entertainment writing for them, but I also write about financial services and technology. I actually just did an article today about a Chinese company that is taking its cryptocurrency mining operations to Kazakhstan because the Chinese government is cracking down on cryptocurrency, which you probably weren't expecting that, but hey, that's part of Phil Hall's day. So I've got my fingers in all different places and all different ideals. I might be doing another radio play. I did a radio play for NUTMEG Junction, which is a radio theater endeavor out of Connecticut. I adapted Moby Dick as a two-part radio play. I actually played Ahab in the production, and that's online. If you do a Google search for NUTMEG Junction, Moby Dick, Phil Hall, you'll find it. I was hoping to do another play, but at the moment there's so much going on now with the book and also my other writing that I haven't been able to set aside any time to start any new projects.
Sure, I suppose that's a nice problem to have. All right, I'm telling you, we're giving you the Scarlet A, but for adaptability. Phil Hall, you are Mr. Adaptability. I mean, that's how it happens. And so people must pick up the book, Jesus Christ Movie Star. It is available right now, Amazon bestseller. Woot. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, John. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.